Good day, everyone, and welcome to our session on how organizations can best create cultures of innovation and foster safe environments for disruptive thinking. My name is Kerrie Finch. I'm the founding partner of futurefactor. We're a communications consultancy. We're based in Amsterdam, London, and Los Angeles. And we work with creative businesses, tech innovators, and conscious brands. And we help them to shape and sustain a leadership position. Now, today, I'm here with three experts busy on a daily basis, creating, researching, and working in innovation cultures in the fields of digital product creation, sustainable materials and packaging, and also industrial and interaction design. We have here today with us Alex Deschamps-Sonsino, who is a consultant, an entrepreneur, and an Internet of Things expert. She's also the author of the book, Creating a Culture of Innovation. If you haven't read it already, grab a copy. It's brilliant. With us today also is Kati Vilkki. She's the lead coach and organizational whisperer at digital agency Reaktor, where she's an advocate for, basically no management layers. And Hassan Rmaile, he's the vice president and general manager of label and graphics materials at Avery Dennison, EMENA, where amongst many other things, he oversees the research and development activity of the brand. Please welcome all of them. Thank you, everyone. And by the way, audience, please do send in your questions. We'll take them as many as we can through the session. Don't save them up to the end because it'll be too late. And we don't want you to miss the opportunity to interact with our speakers. So without further ado, we've got lots to get through. So let's dive in. Alex, let's start with you. You've spoken previously, many times about the importance of disruptive cultures and how can colleagues and management teams alike have trust in a disruptive culture. I'm fascinated to know how that even works.
I mean, I think what we're talking about is not so much trust as permission, and giving people permission to produce ideas that are going to be valued by the organization, that are going to be socialized in an organization and actually stick and become projects. And so I think that creating trust makes it sound like it's sort of a management to do when actually I think it's coming from both sides. So making sure that everybody who is not only in your innovation department, but actually at every layer of the business has the permission to contribute new ideas.
Kati, how does that work at Reaktor? Because you have a very specific way of working and managing the team, particularly my understanding is in the Amsterdam office. What is the relationship between innovation and trust amongst your team?
I see them really heavily interlinked. Because in order for people to be innovative, we need to have our cognitive capacity at our use. And the more there's fear, anxiety, or uncomfortable feelings, the less we have capacity to be innovative. What we are trying to do and what we have done is we have never actually had hierarchies or formal hierarchies. And now, even though we are growing bigger, we are talking about leadership networks and hubs in the leadership networks rather than management teams or other position-based forms of power. And I think that when we are in an environment where people feel trust and are trusted, feel safe, then we are actually smarter. Fear makes us more stupid.
Hassan, what's your view on that fear makes us stupid? How do we innovate with trust in the room? How does that work at Avery Dennison?
Yeah, so I think if you look at innovation in general, I think it's not really a top-down management directive. I think you need to set the vision and the strategy at the top, but I do strongly believe in the power of people on the grassroots perspective. So you have to enable people on the ground level to come up with ideas and provide a safe environment and an air cover by the leadership allow people to experiment and come up with new ideas and new disruptions and new business models. So it's really an enablement culture that allows people to not fear of failure, have no fear of failure, allow them to take more risk and be enabled to think creatively and outside the box. So it's a combination of enablement, strategic vision at the top, but also an informal culture that allows a lot of these ideas to flow through from the bottoms up.
And how does that specifically work at Avery Dennison?
I mean, it's to bring it into reality. I give you maybe one good example. We have a program called Imagine in our region that was established a few years back. And Imagine program, essentially, we tell our teams, hey, we got 3 or 4 strategic areas we're focusing on: sustainability, digitalization, intelligence, electrification. Some key themes. And we allow the teams to brainstorm and bring some of these ideas, flow it through a digital platform system, and we review that on a monthly basis and be able to fund or shelf or accelerate some of these ideas. And it took a while, so it's not something that you turn on the switch in one day and then suddenly everybody's innovative. Honestly, it's a journey. It takes 3, 4, several years to build that culture and that momentum. But this enabled a lot of our team members to submit these ideas and not operate with the concept or with the assumption that all the big ideas come from the top. Actually, most of the big ideas come from within the team, and they flow to the top, and then we invest and resource them.
Alex, you've had a huge amount of insight into various companies and different cultures. What are the problems that many companies are facing when it comes to trying to instill a sense of innovation and trust within their businesses, within their corporations?
I think the biggest challenge has always been staff turnover. The FTSE 100 tend to keep staff around for less than 2 years. This is a huge problem because for innovation purposes, you have to have people who are willing to, and happy to stick around in your organization for a long time, and who are going to feel like their contribution will grow over the years. Some of the leaders that I spoke to when writing the books were really people who had been in those organizations for 15, sometimes 20 years. And that is the exception these days rather than the rule. And I think that innovation is about how you construct a feeling inside a business that where the trust, the permissions are built up and they grow with time, and people feel more and more confident to socialize with colleagues across a business, have ideas that are transdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, cross-departmental, and then things can happen. But without that focus on keeping people around, and you must ask yourself questions if you can't keep your staff around, then your ability to act on that innovation is going to be affected.
That's a really great answer. Thank you for that. And Kati and Hassan, how does that, work specifically in your companies? How do you keep your staff? How do you keep them motivated so that they are innovating and there is trust in the room? Kati, perhaps I can ask you.
Yeah, I think it starts with having a huge amount of respect for people. And then allowing people to come up with ideas and exploring them. For example, we put a satellite out in the space, the first nanosatellite in Finland 2018, which is not part of our core business. And it started because somebody came up with the idea of that would be cool to do, and then several other people joined in. So trying to use the company to build great people, not use the people to create a good company. So start with the people first.
And Hassan, what happens, do you think, when trust has been broken? How does that moment affect the culture of innovation? We've had a tough year, and I think a lot of trust has been broken. Sorry to interrupt, but, I just wanted to mention that, there was a recent survey by ADP in the Harvard Business Review, which said that trust is at an all-time low post-COVID-19. So, I think that trust and empowerment in organizations is really complicated right now. How is Avery Dennison coping with that?
Yeah, I'm actually proud to say within our organization, we did not do a survey specifically on the trust perspective, but based on the engagement surveys and the employee surveys and inclusion surveys, at least for our region here that I'm representing here, our engagement and inclusion and engagement and participation has been really high, which is not really surprising because even though we're all virtual, Avery Dennison is really built on a culture and generations of people coming in and out. It was originally started by our founder, Stan Avery. It was built based on a family-based culture, even though we're a public Fortune 500 company. But that culture propagates down through different generations. So it feels like a family environment, and we have amazing connections across the teams regionally and globally. And we take a lot of energy and pride to continue and propagate that. And that came very powerful during the pandemic because we're all virtual. Suddenly we went 100% offline. But I could tell you the last year and a half, it's been a great ride with the team. Despite all the challenges, the pandemic, being offline, I think the team really thrived. And part of it goes back to what Kati mentioned, is the power of people and human networks. I think that honestly is the number one key differentiator within organizations. If you focus on the people, things will happen. If you only focus on numbers and ignore the people, your numbers, things will look good, but eventually you'll lose the cultural foundation of the company. So if you focus on people, empowered people, included people are heavily engaged, very passionate about what they're doing, I think you cannot go wrong with that recipe. So,
Alex, what's your opinion on that? With the changes in the way that we're working in the last 18 months?
I think we have to recognize the impact that it's had on people's ability to find what I call kind of office neighborhoods, let's call it.
That's a great phrase.
Yeah, it just the idea that you have a handful of colleagues that you might not immediately be working with, but you're sort of hanging out with because you share the same facilities, you share the same gym, you go, and you do sort of stuff at lunchtime together. I think that's been the thing that does create different kinds of conversations about the work that you're doing. And so with the sort of culture within some organizations of, half-hourly video calls all day long, being able to take that time that's sort of unstructured, it's not a meeting, it's really a time to socialize with others. I think that's been really difficult for some people to build into their day-to-day life and their day-to-day schedules.
Yeah, there's been a huge amount of change. Kati, any thoughts on that from your perspective?
A lot of our teams have come up with really innovative ways of working together and also getting the feeling of communality. And have felt that it has worked pretty well. And that said, I think there's also a huge debt to pay in terms of people really being hungry to be together, to see each other. Now it has opened a little bit up here in Finland, so we can meet up with up to 10 people, and I think they are getting rid of the other restrictions. So, and I have had the first face-to-face sessions and trainings last week, this week. And
congratulations.
It is so innovating, so lovely to get the energy back from others, which doesn't happen remotely. And I think what we are learning now is that what are the things that we really need to be together in the same place? For example, complex topics, conflicts, and so on. And then what are the things that we can do remotely, virtually, over distance? But I don't think that we will. I don't believe in going fully remote ever for complex topics, and I think the human connection is still needed.
And when we think about a culture of innovation, we might not think about the physical conditions that people work in. Alex, do you have examples of companies that have used their offices in interesting ways?
Absolutely. I mean, I think to the point that Kati is making, which is, this kind of desire for physical presence. I think there's also a huge amount of our communities that are less abled who have really enjoyed the pandemic, because suddenly the ability for a space to adapt to any of their needs wasn't a requirement anymore. And I do think that we have to think about what that means. Most of our offices are still poorly aligned for accessibility, any kind of needs in terms of more accessible spaces. Most of our spaces are also still extremely unfriendly to parents. They don't necessarily have crushes on site, and any idea of sort of anybody having a life that requires care is still not built into most offices. And I think that those are the offices that really get it, is the ones that have put that at the forefront from day one. And so they make the pandemic, let's say, sort of transition away from a state of, absolute emergency into a state of sort of more new normal. They will be the businesses, I think, that will win. The ones that are businesses that keep focusing on poorly ventilated spaces that have, or really quite enclosed spaces that haven't really looked at their strategy in terms of how many people can come in, or are coming up with strategies that people are really fighting against. And last week's sort of scandal at Apple is a really good example, where, imposing a sort of Monday, Tuesday, Thursday isn't going to work for everyone. And it's going to be really messy, and it's going to be really complicated to schedule things, but things have to be inclusive and have to include as many of your colleagues as possible, even the ones that actually don't want to come back because their immunity doesn't allow them to, their social conditions doesn't allow them to, or their abilities don't allow them to.
And Kati, you've been nodding along. What are your, what's going on in your head whilst Alex is talking?
I see this now post-COVID or living with COVID for long term as a huge opportunity to rethink what environments, physical environments we need. And it's really not the traditional box type of office where you sit still and look at the wall in front of you, but look at things that invite us to move around, to meet each other, to be surprised, to use the hunter-gatherer brains of ours.
I like that.
And I agree completely that I see this as an opportunity. Some companies will come out of this much better, and then those companies that don't trust their people to figure out the best ways of working together, who don't try to accommodate for the different needs, I think they will suffer in the long term, because the lack of competent people that is a constant problem in knowledge work. All companies want to have the best people working for them. And people will have a choice.
Yeah, Hassan, you focus a lot on diversity and inclusion. How do you think this can help drive innovation, and particularly post-COVID?
Yeah, I think just starting with diversity and linkage to innovation, I have a foundational conviction that diversity and inclusion is a prerequisite for innovation. Without going too far, I'll use a very recent example. The development of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine happened in around 9 months. If you look back historically, the fastest ever vaccine was developed. It's not even close to 9 months. So when people diverse backgrounds, you get an American company with a German company, you get some German nationals that happen to have Turkish descent, and then you blended people from virology and cancer therapy. That's where the messenger RNA therapy came into the vaccine world from the chemotherapy world. So if you look at all of these, this is just a recent example that most people would connect with, because we're still not fully out of the pandemic. But even if you look historically, many of the Nobel Prize winners, if you look all the way back to some of the biggest disruptions in history, they tend to sit at the intersection of multiple disciplines, where somebody in economics have a great idea, and then they partner with somebody in finance or chemistry or physics or engineering, and came up with really a greater idea by blending those areas. So that's on the linkage between diversity and innovation. On the point of leveraging the pandemic going forward, I think it really comes back to inclusion and leveraging the element of inclusion and giving some flexibility. I don't think we will go back to pre-pandemic, but also we cannot just completely stay offline, because you cannot substitute the human touch and the human element in any way, shape, or form without having that physical interaction, but creating some kind of flexibility so it's pretty inclusive. I think Alex mentioned the Apple example. I'm curious how that will end up at the end, because there's 2,800 employees that wrote a letter to Tim Cook to try to adjust it. So we'll see how that shakes out. But yes, I think flexibility is going to be paramount, especially as you look at the new workforce, millennials and Gen Z. They probably appreciate flexibility more than we're used to in previous generations. So that's an idea to keep an eye on. But I think highly inclusive, highly diverse companies will absolutely be the winners in the long run.
Cross-borders thinking in its greatest, broadest sense is the way forward. Everybody, how can we make sure we're designing to fully include underrepresented groups?
Can I just come in with like the basics, which is HR practices that aren't racist would be really good.
There's a place to start.
It's just a small thing, but
just
it's something
putting it out there.
Biases in HR tools are really well known. They're really well recognized, and we keep using them. And I just, I think that's absolutely shocking. We also know that any automation done with HR, especially sort of machine learning based selection of candidates, have been proven to fail. And so I think, the basics, which is the first port of call in an organization, is how that HR function is actually able to select candidates. I think it has to be a job, and I do recruitment on a continual basis for one of my clients right now. You have to, really think about where you're advertising and who has access to that particular sort of job description, and who's likely to identify with it, and how could someone exclude themselves from applying because they're reading something in the language. So there's a fantastic gender coded sort of filter, so you can submit the language you use to describe a job, and it will give you a gender coding, just so you understand who you're much more likely to attract because of even the words you use in the job description. So things like that, I think, that's my 10 cents.
That's really important points that you're making, and something that every country and every company can and should be adopting. Kati, how does it work at Reaktor? How are you including underrepresented groups?
Women are really, really heavily underrepresented in software and tech. And I think there are also structural issues involved. So that not only the things that Alexandra mentioned, what we can do within a company. So we have been involved in programs for school children to get girls to start coding and things like. I think it starts also from there that if only 15-20% of the students in software and tech areas are women, then it's really, really difficult for a tech company to hire 50% women. So it needs to start also, the companies start influencing the world around and the schools and provide opportunities for already girls and small girls even to get involved. The other is you asked how can we ensure that we fully somehow are able to design, and unfortunately I don't think it's possible, but right. We can start with everybody in the company also becoming aware of our biases and how we tend to think differently and treat people differently, so that when we get people in from different backgrounds, we are more sensitive in everyday interaction. I have been the only woman in an organization of 300 men, the only woman in a leadership team of 7. So I have personal experience on how easily it happens with no bad intention from anybody. But we just don't take into account the one who is a little bit different. And I think we can do a lot in terms of educating everybody to understand a little bit better that
I think that's true.
We see the world is not the one.
It's
not them.
education. Sorry to interrupt you there. It is education, isn't it? And it's inclusion starts with I, basically. I'm interested to know about rebellion. How is rebellion encouraged, and how does rebellion help a good corporate culture to innovate? What's your views on that, everybody? Alex, please.
I feel like I'm at school raising my hand, asking for permission, and you're trusting me with an answer, which is great. I think that rebellion, or what we think of as rebellion, is really interesting in a time of both Me Too, but also corporate scandals, left, right, and center, with how harassment and abuse is treated in the workplace. I think it also has the ability to basically to leave a business with a part of a project is an act of supported rebellion, and more corporate more corporate supported rebellion. So the idea that you might be so successful on a project that you will just be asked to leave to lead that project on after, and the business trusts you to do the right thing, and maybe takes a stake in that particular spin-off, etc. That's a form of loose, kind of fluffy rebellion, when we have a lot of very I think very needed, very tangible rebellion that's happening now.
Hassan, how does rebellion show its head at Avery Dennison?
I was gonna tell Alex, you don't need to raise your hand. There's no need for permission. You could just jump in. Yeah, in terms of rebellion, I think I use the word disruption or non-conformity. Right, it's a little bit different angle to it. But I think part of linking it diversity and inclusion is empowering people who think differently and that bring ideas or new business models that's not really part of the traditional linear thinking, and encouraging people who have non-linear thinking, and also partnering them with different people in the organization. But we create a culture and nurture a culture that empowers that and give it the air cover, because like I said earlier, it really starts with leadership, belief and conviction in many of these areas: inclusion, diversity, sustainability, innovation. You could give great speeches, but if you don't believe in it, people are very smart. They will read behind the lines. So it's really
absolutely
making sure you give the air cover, and things will happen. People will bring ideas. People will bring ideas that could disrupt your core business, which could not be very popular, but something you need to keep an eye on, because if you don't, somebody else will disrupt your core business. So, but it's really around incubation, encouraging that culture that is very comfortable with speak up culture. That's also a very good prerequisite for rebellion.
Kati, I'd love to understand about activism and how that relates to a good corporate culture, do you think? What's your experience there?
When I was working for Nokia for 24 years, I used to call myself a corporate rebel, because I was challenging organizational practices and encouraged others to do it. And there was an immense sense of freedom when we, for example, an organization of 3,000 people rebelled against the completely dysfunctional performance management system. So for me, my leadership, high school or academy, was actually working, before joining Nokia, working in many activist and non-governmental organizations, where I learned that actually people always choose their leaders. In big companies where managers are appointed, this gets blurred. You can appoint a manager, but you can't appoint a leader. You cannot lead somebody against their will. People always choose. And in activist groups, this is very visible. So if you want people to follow you, you need to create the trust, you need to show empathy, you need to know what you are doing, you need to have the emotional intelligence to stay functional in a state of crisis. And I was really happy that I had learned all that before I joined Nokia, and was able to start changing the leadership culture there in the way one person can influence, which is actually much more than what we usually think. And I think that's a really good learning for anybody, to think that how do you actually create a relationship, such relationship with others that they are willing, they choose to follow you. They choose to be led by you. all leaders should have that, in my opinion.
Alex, what's your thoughts on that? About choice?
I mean, I think it's really interesting because I also think that we thrive really successfully even in the worst conditions. I mean, look at the crisis. I think we've not chosen anything about this. And I think we have, for most of us, managed to at least not lose our minds. And I think that's sort of baseline success. I think that, for example, I pick in my book an example of cafeterias. There's a lot of focus in the past 20 years on, you know, free food with lots of different options, etc. And one of my nicest finds for the book is actually a rating of the top research departments in the world and science research departments in the world, a rating of how bad their cafeterias are. Because in fact, the idea that something is bad within an organization that's sort of, you know, it's a tangible thing. Every lunchtime you sort of have a bit of a moan, that can allow allyship and allow people to come together around a particular shared problem. And I think that that creates its own sorts of communities. It creates its own sorts of resilience within teams, because it means that people feel like, yes, everyone recognizes that this is a problem. It's probably not a problem that's important enough for us to complain about. And we can still keep going, and we can have, you know, a gentle moan on a direct message on Slack or whatever. And I think knowing the difference between these manageable problems that are, you know, sort of not easy necessarily to solve, but also benign, versus the fundamental big problems that, yeah, you do need kind of great leadership, and for leadership to be really attuned to. Those two things build resilience in different ways, I think.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Let's move on to regeneration and future of work and future of innovation. Hassan, what are some of the challenges for managing for circular or regenerative outcomes, do you think? How do you connect, you know, learning to sustainability? What's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, I think sustainability and regeneration is really one of the main themes for all of us across, regardless which industry or which business you're in. If you look in the next 100 years, we need to be able to reduce, recycle, make a very productive circular economy. One of the two key challenges in my mind, one is the changes in climate change. It's happening so incrementally. It's very easy for somebody to say, hey, okay, the temperature is moving by 0.1 degrees Celsius. It's not going to happen for 100 years. So it's easy to say, okay, let's not do something about it. But that's the biggest challenge, is how do you overcome that and make sure everybody pushes in the same direction? I think that's one key challenge, because the incremental change is so small, is how do you drive and encourage everybody to think very creatively? The second challenge is not to get overwhelmed or have a knee-jerk reaction on specific item. You see a lot of comments on plastic packaging and banning plastic and all that. If you look back, last 100 years, plastic was one of the biggest inventions of the 20th century. Plastic is not bad, it's just being used irresponsibly. So if you use it responsibly, I think you'll be in great shape. If plastic is fully recyclable, it's one of the best materials you could have. So we need to have that conversation and not get carried away by emotions, comparing plastic with paper. I mean, paper uses way more water to make a single sheet of paper, and creating even way more carbon emissions. So a lot of these debates need to be fundamentally and scientifically based. Of course, you go swim in the ocean, you see more plastic, because the heavier stuff goes to the bottom, like metal and glass, right? So you don't see it. So really having that fundamental scientific and quantitative debate, balancing it with emotion and what you see and consumer preferences and things like that. It's really, these are the two major challenges in my view. In our position, I think we're trying to push for that circular and regenerative economy and solutions, but also there's a human dimension to that, which is the human capital, and making sure all of us, as we run our businesses, not to think of us running the business, but ask yourself, would your next generation, whether it's your children or grandchildren or whoever, would they be proud of the decisions you made 25 or 50 years earlier? I think that's the way to think about it in terms of legacy, to leave the earth in a better place than you found it. So that's really the big picture, and the rest is just filling in the blanks, is how do you get there to achieve that vision in the short and medium term.
Alex, who's your... Sorry, Kati, please.
A little bit on the emotional side, because I think a key thing is to learn to be comfortable to be uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. So when we think of things like climate change or any other big problems, that tends to make us uncomfortable. There's anxiety, fear, there's uncertainty. That's connected to innovation. That's crucial part of any change. And in my experience, it is a skill we can learn. We can learn to be comfortable with uncomfortable feelings, so that those emotions don't stop us from doing something, from thinking about it, from working on it.
Thanks for that, Kati. We've got a few more moments. I'd love to get everybody's input on who is your go-to for inspiration in terms of innovation and the future of work. Alex, who is inspiring you?
Weirdly, a company that is no longer successful, but it was extremely successful for over 50 years, which is Olivetti, the typewriter manufacturers. They were the first, one of the first organizations to offer their staff facilities on site that you would struggle to see today, whether that was educating their staff to let them graduate from high school inside of the business, even though they worked at the factory floor, whether that was helping them actually spend their paycheck properly and giving them budget support, or even a creche inside the business. All of those things were in place before they even got a canteen.
Good
and so
them.
I still look to them as real leaders at their time.
And trailblazers. Hassan and Kati, very quickly, who's your inspiration in the field of, the future of work and innovation?
Kati, you go first.
I don't actually have any one company. Also because I think that you can't really copy anything from one company to another. What I'm fascinated about is many startups, and I'm also fascinated about what happens to them when they grow up. So
it's the growing pains that you're worried about. And Hassan, very quickly, because we're running out of time.
Yeah. For me personally, I don't have any specific name or specific company, because to me it's a collection of systems and companies. The one, if you only call one area, it's really the electrification of the global economy. Because if you look at what's happening across that value chain, you're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. It's really impressive to see that, and it's more impressive because if you look 100 years ago, there used to be electric vehicles. They were not efficient enough. Charge density was low, and people figured a way to redisrupt that industry. And the original invention, actually, if you look back, it came from ExxonMobil, was the original inventor of some of the basic work for electrification. That most people get surprised when they hear that. And then Sony took it to the next level. And then Tesla kind of made it a general mass market, right? So you really have to give credit to everybody across the value chain, nobody specific. But typically, I would say anything linked to electrification, value chain, it's the biggest disruption in the last 20 years. So.
Thank you, both of you. And Alex, very, very quickly, let's end with you. What's the one thing you'd like the audience to leave with today? What's the one thing that folks can take away from today's session?
I think reconsider your physical environment at the same level as you reconsider your permissions layer inside your business and how you give people permission.
Brilliant. I want to thank Kati, Vilkki. I want to thank Alex. I want to thank Hassan. And of course, you, the audience. Thank you for listening and tuning in. Please do stay curious. Over and out.